From Chicago's CAN TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi again. Welcome to the show. So the democratic process continued again this week in Chicago as we saw the first of about 150 hearings on the school closings. It's kind of curious, don't you think, since the mayor's already made it clear that the time for debate is over and the moving contractors are already inventorying all the furniture, but still a lot of people showed up just to get their opinions on the record. And one of those was a most interesting guy who showed up to protest the closing of Trumbull. That's that massive school at Ashland and Foster. He said CPS isn't being completely honest about Trumbull. He said that they're saying it would cost about $16 million to upgrade and operate the school, but the speaker insisted that a more realistic number was probably something around like $4 million. And you'd think he ought to know, because when he's not challenging the note takers at these public hearings, he's the mayor's floor leader and the chairman of the city council's education committee. So Alderman Pat O'Connor has something in common with the editorial board at the Chicago Sun-Times. Both of them have asked CPS to reconsider parts of their sweeping plan that will in some way affect about a quarter of all of Chicago public schools. And both have been pretty much ignored so far as we can see. So here today to help us get some perspective is Kate Grossman, who is deputy editorial page editor for the Chicago Sun-Times. Kate, welcome to the show. And also columnist Mark Brown from the Sun-Times, who by his own account became unhinged the other day as he was up on the north side watching some remodeling being done someplace. And we'll be talking to him about that on the show too. Mark, welcome back to the show. Glad to have you both here. So I have to ask you, I made the rounds of a couple of the hearings on this week. Is this just theater? Is this just a big show? I mean, we all know that this is a done deal, right? These schools are going to close. If they change it, maybe they'll nibble around the edges and take one or two off the table. But the public hearings are just a complete and total waste of time, are they not?
Well, I'd like to think they aren't. I mean, ByrdBennett, the school CEO, when she started in October, I went to the Urban League where she launched sort of this whole campaign and talking about school closing. And this is when she said there was an imminent deadline for announcing a school closing list. And she said, I want to push it back. I want to hear from the community. I want to hear from the community up front before the decisions are made, which really is different than what CPS has done in the past. Mm-hmm. And I don't think it was, I think she was speaking from the heart. I think she really meant it. And she has so far in the process, you know, she got this commission, which some people have criticized, but I thought they did pretty good work. And she accepted pretty much all of their recommendations in terms of, which basically removed schools from consideration for closure. So up until this point, she has done, I think, a good job of listening. Now, we are at the point where they're clearly committed to moving forward this plan. Although I do want to, you know, this thing about Emmanuel saying negotiations are over, that's actually not what he said.
That is a little unfair.
Right, and I'm bringing it up because I've been to several of the hearings and everybody brings it up. Yeah. And what he said was, you know, it's time to move forward. So, which is not exactly the same. I'm not saying that they aren't fully committed, but you know, so but I agree. I think what'll probably end up happening is they'll dump a few schools off the list. They will listen to maybe Trumbull and maybe a few others that make very compelling cases for you know, staying open. And you know what we've been arguing for is that there's probably more than just a few, and they need to listen really hard because they've done this so quickly, and it's based off of, you know, formulas on paper about how well used a building is. And they've done, you know, more than that, but the formula is very blunt and it packs kids into a school. And so a school that on paper is half empty, you go there and
it
does not look half empty. It looks like they're using their space wisely.
Well, it's been very interesting watching the way you guys have been covering this on the editorial page, because I think it's fair to say you're on board with the idea that schools have to close, but you've said that at the very least, couldn't we cut this list in half and do it over 2 years? Do we really have to, can we take another look at some of these schools? You went to Garvey Elementary, which was that actually you personally? Were you?
Yeah, I went to Garvey.
I suspected as much, right? Yeah. And you had an experience that I think a lot of people have when you get down to the single school level and you start looking at the schools. Obviously, this is not true, it's not universally true for these 50 schools, but there are a lot of really decent schools on that list.
And the thing that was most galling to me about Garvey was two things. One is that on paper it's approximately 50% utilized, which I already said, but it's a small little school, and it was a lovely little school, and they were, as far as I could tell, using every room. And number two, the school that's supposed to absorb Garvey actually has slightly lower test scores. The other school does better on CPS's performance measure because its scores have been improving, but the other school is improving to come up to where Garvey is. So they have more points because they're improving. You're a parent at Garvey School. It's a lovely little school. You're like, why would I want my kids to go to this school? We're working here, and you know, and so not that Garvey is perfect, and they have relatively low test scores, but that just doesn't make any sense. So I think that, and again, I'm sure there's lots of examples of schools where it does make sense to close, and from a financial perspective, even though the savings are pretty modest, you know, it makes sense to consolidate schools.
You know, I have to say that this is one of these things where the picture is so large that no one person can really kind of get a real sense of it. But as you've pointed out, and U of I pointed out, it's a quarter of the schools that we're talking about here.
I mean, isn't that the frustrating thing? Is you can't get a handle on what's going on because of the massiveness of it. You know, every situation is a school that you feel like to speak up on it, you need to analyze and drill down. Now they say they've done that, and to a great extent, as you go through these, you can see, well, no, that made some sense how they may have done that. You know, Kate has found some of the ones that, like, you're left scratching your head. Now, yesterday, the CPS has been inviting reporters out to do tours with Barbara ByrdBennett, and she's trying to visit all of the quote-unquote welcoming schools before the end of the month. And I took a tour of one of the welcoming schools with her, and I pressed on this issue of, well, are you, and she's not going to any of the closing schools. I mean, she would say, oh, I've been to closing schools before, and I'm sure I'll be to more closing schools, but that's not where they're at. They're moving forward.
Don't work for that.
They're moving forward, and she says they're very comfortable with the proposal that they've given to the board, and if the board makes changes, but I don't think you're going to get changes coming from them, unless they're political changes that someone can force.
Yeah, this is just wildly speculative, and I don't want to drag you guys down this rabbit hole with me, but as people who've been around Chicago for a while, we know that Chicago is a very political city, and it's divided into 50 very political wards. And I saw in, I think, your newspaper a chart once a few weeks ago that showed the wards in which all of the closing schools are located, and I found it so interesting that no ward has more than 3 or 4 of them. They're spread out among a fairly large number of aldermen. And I just had to think that also was a consideration in this. You can't close too many of them, so you get one alderman who has 8 or 9 schools being closed.
Although there are some aldermen that certainly have 5 or 6, because they're concentrated on the south and the west side. But Trumbull School, which you mentioned, I'm not surprised Trumbull is on the list, even though they make a very compelling place to stay open, because it's on the north side.
Right. They had to have something.
And they cannot close only south and west side schools. That's just politically unpalatable. So, that those factors come into play with that.
And you have to also imagine that the chairman of the City Council Education Committee was essentially told, or perhaps he even just said it himself. It's like, I got to have one. I need to have one so that I can say, look, even I am being affected by this.
Oh, jeez, Ken, I can't believe you think that way. The Barbara ByrdBennett is a very smart politician, from what I've been able to see of this so far. I mean, many of the aldermen are very happy with their negotiations with her in advance that whittled down the lists of closing schools, and that of course it was always going to get whittled down, but it was whittled down with the aldermen had some input on this. They got to argue their case in a lot of these cases, And you know, so I think, you know, that they have some, you know, while a lot of aldermen are still squawking, they're complaining. You also know that you know, behind the scenes, you know, there have been agreements already. Well, look, we got to do this, but
there's a whole different set of negotiations going on.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that there's much negotiations going on now at all.
No,
I don't think there are. I think they're moving forward. I think.
No, I meant up until the day
yes.
that the announcement was
Right.
made.
Oh yeah, there was a lot.
That's when the people are grabbing people by the arm in the back of the city council and saying, "I need to talk to you about."
Yeah. And but the larger point is too that when you count all the closures and these things they called co-locations and turnarounds, we're talking about 47,000 kids that they want to do something to their school.
Yeah.
Mostly very dramatic things by August.
Right. Right.
47. This is why we say either whittle down that list or do it over 2 years and still whittle it down some. It's just, this is a bureaucracy that doesn't do most things well, even when everything is peachy keen.
When it's just closing. Well, I mean, again, veterans, we've been around, we've seen this before. I mean, they've been closing schools for 10 years. This is not something new, but normally it's 2 or 3 or 4 schools and all
most
hell breaks loose.
12.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think that in my day I've ever seen a more, what do you want to call it, a more comprehensive action that involves more people, more parents, more teachers, more schools, more everything. And it's going to leave a lot of real estate on the real estate market that, you know, again, that's just another issue that God only knows what's going to happen to these schools that are just going to be left there. But that also raises another issue, which I find fascinating, that some of these schools, like Garvey, I'm not pinpointing Garvey, but it just happens to be one that's on the table now, but some of these schools are really in pretty good shape. They're in physically good shape, and they would just be perfect places for charter operators to come in and just snap it up and open up a charter school. Wouldn't that work to the wouldn't that fit in with the political agenda?
Well, that's what they had been doing previously with the closures, and that's why we don't have a lot of empty school buildings in Chicago the way Detroit and Cleveland and other cities do. But ByrdBennett made a pledge, and I assume she's going to honor it as long as she's CEO, that she will not put charters in there because they're just so politically, it's such a football, and because the theory is that they're closing these schools so that they will be charters, because that's the mayor, you know, really favors charters. Right. So, yeah, it's a tough one, but I see why she made that pledge, and to get through this experience of closing these schools, I don't see how she could have done it differently.
So your assessment, and I don't think there are too many people better qualified to make this assessment at this point. Your assessment of Barbara ByrdBennett is that she is she's well-meaning. She intends to do good. I mean, she certainly came in a very favorable way. I had a very favorable view of her when she took over. I think maybe because of the contrast to what we had before. But it really also seems like a lot of the critics who say that, you know, she is part of that sort of national movement where you move in, you close schools, you essentially privatize the schools, and you know. Right.
Although, I mean, to be fair, all the closures prior to this were usually about performance. This is about under-enrollment. You can quibble with whether these schools are truly under-enrolled fairly, but that's what this is about. So, and I mean, Barbara ByrdBennett has said publicly that she started off being opposed to charter schools, and now she's come around to sort of basically being agnostic. She just wants good schools, whatever flavor. So I don't think Barbara ByrdBennett personally has any motivation to turn these into charters. But that said, Barbara ByrdBennett isn't running the school system by herself.
No, of course.
She works for Rahm Emanuel, who likes charter schools. You know, and I'm not saying that there is or isn't a big conspiracy to turn a third of the schools into charters or whatever, but that's certainly favored. Charters are favored, and that is the backdrop, whether Barbara ByrdBennett wants that or not. That's the backdrop that she's operating in.
One of the things that I've had the hardest time understanding is this idea that in really distressed neighborhoods that have been historically disinvested in, where there are very few resources, one of the few things that continues to operate, maybe not as well as we would like it to, is the public school. And to you would think that there would be a real effort to try to, even in these, if it's chronically under-enrolled, yes, but everything sort of slightly above that strata, you would think that there would be an effort to try to keep these places going as community centers as much as they are schools, that they're kind of community anchors, and there's a real need for them to be there. Just shutting them down seems to me to be like, I don't know, it's like it's giving up.
Right. Well, CPS argues that they'd rather spend the money that's going into school A, that's the third full, and put the money into school B and have that be 100% full. You know, I argue, you know, sure, that makes sense, but the savings isn't a lot, and there's a tremendous loss, right? Just as you're
articulating. The price of that loss is higher than what the dollar savings might be in the long run. That's been
kind of the guiding principle, like the cost-benefit analysis here.
And also, and I will get off of the soapbox, but the other thing that kind of bugs me about this is that the schools that are in areas like Bronzeville, for example, where obviously there's massive under-enrollment because of the loss of all of the high-rises and the housing developments, one of the highest priorities for the city is to try to get those neighborhoods to really spring to life, and they will. In the next 10 years, you're going to see those neighborhoods become thriving places when the economy picks up. But the schools are going to be closed. So, I mean, what's the point? Wouldn't it make sense to sort of bank these schools and invest in these schools so that they would become magnets for people who want to move into those communities? But I guess I've said all this before, so I apologize, Mark.
No, it's very frustrating to you know, I mean, you see a school close in that building in the neighborhood, it's just going to be an albatross. Yeah. It's going to, you know, it's going to drag down the neighborhood. Now, you know, they're talking. I'm sure there's going to be a tussle to get control of these buildings, either by church groups or, you know, everybody's going to have their idea. But this is CPS. You know, CPS doesn't want to be the landlord for the buildings anymore. Right. But nobody's going to be able to really buy them. Yeah. You know, there's still going to be a mess.
And they really, I mean, schools are, from an architectural point of view, they're just really difficult to repurpose into other things. You can't exactly make condos out of a classroom. And anyway, enough of this. We could talk about this for the rest of the show. But I do want to just conclude by I want to quote you back. You were talking about the University of Illinois Chicago did that study that was the source of your most recent editorial on this. Was it yesterday? I think it was yesterday. And you say the UIC estimate of 47,500 kids being touched by this rather than 30,000 is more honest, and that mind-boggling number of students to be reshuffled over an exceptionally short period of time is the main reason we urge CPS to scale back its closures this year or spread them over 2 years. Let's get this right. That's the last word from the board of Chicago's less expensive newspaper, Chicago Sun-Times. All right, well, Mark, I got to tell you, I have just been loving these columns that you've been writing recently about, I don't know how to describe it, but the sort of milieu of homeless people living under Wilson Avenue Viaduct, the Salvation Army food trucks, and most recently the SRO buildings. We had a couple of people on talking about that a couple of weeks ago that are closing all over the north side of Chicago, largely in Uptown. But you just spent a little bit of time at the Abbott, which is over on Belmont, and you saw absolutely remarkable things. And I just want to get your impression of what is going on here.
Well, the big picture of what is going on, and you hit on it, is that we have this peculiar sort of housing in Chicago, the old SRO building, which are these small room hotel type buildings. Sometimes they have bathrooms, sometimes there's a bathroom at the end of the hall. And these are, over the years, they've developed into a kind of a low income market housing, but it's not people, it's not government subsidized. Maybe some of the people in there have some sort of, government check or something, but it's poor people on the north side mostly. And some developers have figured out, hey, we go in there, there's now a market for people with just want small, studio, one-bedroom apartments will.
But nicely appointed.
But yeah, nicely appointed. I mean, it's the stuff's all along the lakefront. So they're going in, they're rehabbing them, they're turning them around, and they up the rent $300-400. So what's happening is all kinds of poor people are getting displaced all at once. And
hundreds and hundreds. I mean, we're talking about serious numbers.
I think thousands, thousands and thousands, really. As some of these places have hundreds of people in them. So in this one instance, the Abbott Hotel, the developers said, there's always a problem. You got to get out the old tenants. And some tenants know how to hang in, and some of them just don't have a place to go. And they get these things. You're supposed to go through the court system, but all kinds of extra legal systems have developed, for how you get a tenant out of the building. And there's the nice way, which is offering cash for keys, and then there's just making life miserable for them. And in this particular building, they had gone so far as they were demolishing the entire interior of the building, except for the apartments where 4 or 5 of these people were living. And when I say apartments, I'm one room, maybe a bathroom, maybe a sink, but in some instances, not even that. And they'd taken out the fire, they shut off the heat, they cut off the water. In cutting off the water, they disabled the sprinkler systems, so then they tore out all the fire sprinkler systems. They had shut down the alarm.
But people were still living there,
and they
had valid leases.
Yes, they had valid leases. I mean, you are legally living there until you have been evicted, right? I mean, that's the law. And then there's a whole backstory there of, a lot of times what the landlord will do is they won't accept your rent. So that's one way to get you out, right? So finally, a woman who's living in the building sent me an email, said, look at what's going on here. And I went out and I was like, this is amazing. I mean, I've seen a lot of things up to, short of that going on in the city. You hear about that almost every week, but this one they'd taken it to an extreme.
And these folks, you identify them as BJB properties.
BJB properties. Yes.
And they own or have control over several of these hotels, as far as you know.
They own quite a few of them, and why this is attractive to, why a lot of the aldermen are looking the other way is these properties, a lot of them were owned by a slumlord isn't a nice word, so we won't use that word. A landlord with a bad reputation, and he had owned a lot of these places, and these guys bought them all up at once at one time. And so for an alderman, hey, he's got this property that's been run down and probably a problem all this time. So the idea that some developer is going to turn it into nice housing, well, everybody's looking for progress, and it's hard to stand in the way of the laws of the real estate market. I understand that.
But I mean, you got particularly upset. I mean, I've never seen you use all caps.
Right, all caps.
You're writing in all caps. I will not be bullied. I
didn't want them to bully those people.
What you said was, but back to the nice couple who absolutely did not speak to me. There was a couple outside that you actually you had to help transport them. We'll talk about that. But about that nice couple who absolutely did not speak with me, and if anybody says they did in an effort to weasel out of their end of the deal, I will absolutely hound them in this column as long as this newspaper will allow me, because I can't stand bullies.
Okay, so I got it worked up. But I wrote the column about the bad conditions there, and unfortunately the solution, and I knew from the start this would probably be the only solution, is the city had to shut down the building and kick the people out, which is all these guys wanted anyhow.
Right.
So they won, and these people are kicked out.
Yeah.
And they, even at that, they were still trying to, the building's going to be closed down tomorrow, and you're not going to get anything. So, here, take this little bit of money and move on. And I got upset about it.
I don't blame you.
And then the city was there all day, and they were supposedly giving them social services and helping these people. And this one couple, and I knew about them already, they at the end of the day, they took the money and got out, you know. And I found them on the sidewalk with their bags, and, you know, they were older, and the woman was very overweight, and they weren't sure quite where they were going or how they were going to get there, and they just lost their place. And I ended up being the guy driving them over there, and it made me mad. And it was also the day that Roger Ebert died, and so it was an emotional. It was very emotional.
Well, but of course, it does raise the question of exactly where was the city, not only on that day when they were supposed to be helping these tenants, but the real question is, what's been the role of the city in all of this up to now? I mean, do these guys? I presume they have demolition permits, they have remodeling permits, don't they, to do this?
They do.
How did they get a demolition permit on a building that's still occupied?
I don't entirely understand that, and they had their permits. Had they lied, you know, I've got to do more investigation. Is what it amounts to. But it's part of the situation here was this particular building was not in housing court. There were no violations before they started up. Yeah. So at the time, so that this building wasn't getting that sort of attention. Now, it should have triggered inspections when they were doing this work, and honestly, you know, you and I both know the city. I wonder if some inspectors were looking the other way. Now, they would say, oh, well, these guys were lying to us. We didn't know there were people still in the building. Well, I think they did know.
If we had another half hour, I'd like to ask you about the role of the aldermen in all of this, because you got Tom Tunney and you got James Kappelman and what's going on with them and their thing. But one thing you did say is that they got an order, a court order, the owners, to give a $5,000 donation to Catholic Charities, and you said that's nice and all, but they donated more than 6 times that to Cook County Assessor Joe Barrios to assure a friendly reception for their property tax lawyers, or should I say, to help him get elected. And then you also offered this, that you gave him a suggestion. You said, I'd like to see the owners invite everyone who lived in the Abbott's 88 rooms before they started running them all off to a reunion party at one of the Wrigley Field rooftops that they own. So
the BJB guys are the Purcells. Jamie Purcell is the principal guy. They own some of the Wrigley Field rooftops. I don't know. I don't remember the name off the top of my head of their particular company and their buildings. But yeah, I thought that would be nice. You get all those people together, and they have a little party, and they invite me, and they can then tell me stories about how they were kicked out of the building.
Mark Brown, thank you so much. Kate, thank you so much. Kate Grossman from the editorial board of the Sun-Times. We've just smashed out of time, and we'll have to pick it up again another time. But thank you both for being here today and talking about your great work at the Chicago Sun-Times. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a community service of CAN TV. You know all that already, and you know that you can find us here on cable. But you can also just watch this address right here anytime at all. You just go there and you can watch this show anytime you like. You can check us out on iTunes as a video or audio podcast. And of course, we'll come to your house and do the show if you'd like, whatever you'd like to do. We'll see you next week right here on Chicago Newsroom. Bye.